Hello, today is December the 9th, and if you're here for how to rapidly onboard customers and employees with dynamic workflows featuring our guest presenter, Lawrence Orin, you're in the right place. My name is Scott Abel, the content wrangler, and I'll be your host for today's show. A few things about this webinar just to get you started. Um, we can't see or hear you at all, so you don't have to worry about your cameras at all or your microphone because we don't have access to them. And you can't have a two-way conversation with us. But that begs the question, what can you do during the webinar? So during today's show, here are a few things that you can do. You can ask us a question by using the Ask a Question tab located below your webinar viewing panel. That will allow you to click on a button, open up a little text window, and send us a text message. We cannot text you back, so it's not a two-way channel. It's just one-way broadcast to us. I'll queue up all the questions that you ask during the show, and we'll ask Lawrence at the end of the show as many questions as time allows. You can also access help if you're having any trouble using the platform today. You can check the attachments and links section of your webinar viewing panel to get access to content that might help you overcome some of those challenges. Additionally, we've got additional content provided by the presenter and by the sponsor of today's show, Zoomin Software. You can usually grab a copy of the slides, access links that will take you to contact information for the presenter, and learn about additional topics that are related to today's show, all in the attachments section of your webinar viewing panel. And at the end of the show, I'll remind you to give us feedback on a 1 through 5-star rating, with 5 being the highest rating. And this is based on the quality of the content that Lawrence provides today. That's what we're asking you to rate, and I'll remind you at the end of today's show. All right, without further ado, let's welcome to the virtual stage Lawrence Orin. Lawrence, are you on the line with me?
I am indeed, Scott. How are you?
Excellent. I'm so good. In fact, I am getting accustomed to this working from home thing. I was doing it for a while anyway, but I'm assuming you're also working from home. Is that true?
I am indeed, yes.
And where are
yes.
you broadcasting from today?
I'm broadcasting from a little town called Ra'anana outside Tel Aviv in Israel.
Excellent. I'm coming to you live from Palm Springs, California, where it is a little overcast. It's still nice outside. So hopefully everybody in our viewing audience is settled down at home for the next hour, and we can take off and understand the journey that you'd like to take us on today. Today's show, by the way, before we start, is brought to you by Zoomin Software. Most companies make it really difficult for customers to find the answers that they need to the questions they have about the products and services being offered. So what Zoomin does is it takes all of your technical product content from any source that you've created it, no matter how it was created or published, and then it tries to bring it all together and deliver it into your documentation portal, your community or your customer service support site, even into the products that you create it themselves. This way, your customers can self-serve themselves and find all of the information they need efficiently, and you can reduce your support costs and improve product adoption. If you want to learn more about how Zoomin can help you improve the experience your customers have with your technical documentation content, point your web browser over to zoominsoftware.com or head to the attachments section of our viewing panel today, where you can download some content provided by today's sponsor. All right, without further ado, I am going to transfer the digital podium over to Lawrence Orin, a product evangelist at Zoomin Software. Lawrence, I'll put myself on mute, and I'll be in the background if you need me for any reason during the show.
Thanks very much, Scott. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay. All right, so hello, everyone. My name is Lawrence Orin. I'm product evangelist and content UX expert at Zoomin. And today we're going to be talking about how to onboard customers and employees really quickly using dynamic workflows. So we're going to start today by looking at what workflows are, when they are used, and how they are basically all over product documentation. They've just never been thought of as one of the tools that people have in their product documentation. We'll talk about the different ways that people implement them today and the challenges that those have, and then introduce an idea of dynamic workflows. We'll talk about the use cases of dynamic workflows and how they might impact the way that people do product documentation. Okay. So let's talk about workflows first. What are they? Well, to put quite simply, if you have your content laid out as a set of tasks, and you arrange those tasks into other tasks, into meta tasks, then those meta tasks can often be seen as workflows. The idea being that you have a workflow that each step in the workflow is a task itself, or is a set of tasks that you need to go through in order to do something. So workflows basically make sense of your content. So if you have some topics, okay, like these trees over here, if each one of those was a topic, those topics are in publications, and those publications are all about different products, and you could have a very large library of topics and a very large selection of publications and products, and they're all sitting there in your library. But in order to make sense of that, you might need to light up a path through that dense forest in order to get people to perform a certain task, to get them to their goal. Okay? And you can find this not just in topics, in publications, and so on. You can also find this in education. You can see this, for example, the way that lessons or classes are bunched together in modules, which are bunched together in courses. But those lessons can sometimes be reused in different places and make up different modules and different courses. And in any case, sometimes you just need to perform a certain task. You need to get to a certain goal, and how you bring together different parts of that content to get to that goal, that's really very important. So you typically find these workflows in these big picture overviews, perhaps in a getting started guide, where you kind of give people a path, like I said, that lights people through the forest, through this dense forest of content. And you need a path to get you through to your goal. You can have it during onboarding, during training. This is a very common thing. And you might see these visually, or you might see them in different ways. And what we're going to do first is to look at the traditional challenges of how people implement this in their product content. Now, it's not such an obvious thing. Okay, first of all, it's important to understand that these are really everywhere. And one of the easiest ways of implementing tasks or these workflows is to use your table of contents, right? So lots of us, we produce books, okay? Sometimes those books are training manuals, sometimes they are product documentation, onboarding guides, and so on. And you arrange lots of different things in a hierarchy, in a table of contents. So a typical place, for example, a typical website that has some product content will have a table of contents on the left-hand side. And often, if you want to show a set of tasks, you just create a hierarchy. Piece of cake, right? It's the easiest thing to do. It's the most obvious way of implementing a workflow. So you can imagine your table of contents, if you look at this hierarchy as a chart like this, as a hierarchical chart, then what we're looking at is basically saying, okay, we've got a super topic or a meta topic, a senior topic, a parent topic, and the workflow is basically pointing to its children. Okay, that's the most obvious thing. And very often the way that people implement these is by automatically adding links to the children of a topic in a table of contents. So if you have a table of contents and you're using the hierarchy, why not use it to demonstrate workflows? And it's an obvious thing. So here, for example, is a topic, and it has some links under it. Right? You see those links? And those links correspond to the children of this topic. They just automatically inserted it at the bottom of the topic. So there you have a very easy, simple, ready to go workflow. And this is quite common. Lots of people do this. But there is a problem, and that is that sometimes you hop around the table of contents in order to show your workflow. So, for example, you may have one workflow that requires people to go first on this topic, then on the one of its children, then to hop over to a different part of the publication, and then hop again, and so on. So you can't really use an automatic addition of children because it doesn't really work. And you may have perhaps a different goal, which may be working for a slightly different persona. They need to do the same thing, but in a slightly different way. And they'll have a different hopping over the table of contents like this. So using the table of contents isn't really the most robust solution. It doesn't work in lots of cases. So what people do in this case, when they hop around the table of contents a lot in order to affect a workflow, the most obvious idea is, well, I'm writing all of this documentation. It's a whole bunch of tasks. So I'm going to create a task where each of the steps points to another bunch of tasks, right? And we can see an example of that here, where you have a step, a task. It has a whole bunch of steps in it, and each of those steps points to a different task. And that's a very simple workflow. This one is from a site like this one here, okay? And it's just a set of steps where there are lots of links to different places, and those links don't really correspond to anything in here. They're hopping all over the place. And that's a very common way of implementing a workflow, okay? Here's another example of a set of steps, lots and lots of links. Those links don't really correspond to the table of contents, hopping all over the place, right? And this is because a certain instance in a certain situation with a certain persona needs to go through these particular tasks in this particular order, right? So it's hopping around the library in precisely this way. You can see that here. Okay, here's a thing about how to set up learning instances for a particular bot from a company called Automation Anywhere. And they've got a nice task going on here, whole bunch of steps, but each step actually just points to a much bigger set of steps that's somewhere else. See that? So that makes sense, right? That's often what people do. They go through their tasks, and if they have a map of tasks, then they'll create a task of tasks, just like I've shown here. So that works quite well. There are other ways of doing this as well. Lots of people, for example, use an innovation called goal tables, which kind of started making their entrance into documentation about 5 or 6 years ago in a big way. And the idea is that you would have some actions, a little bit about the action. So basically, this action is a bit like a goal. If you want to do this, go over here. If you want to do that, go over there. If you want to do this, go over somewhere else, right? And so you can have it structured not as a task, but as a table. And tables, they give you much more flexibility. So take a look at this one, for example. This one is from another company where they say, I want to, and they have a whole bunch of goals. And then under here, in fact, why don't we just zip over to their site quickly, and you can see this much more clearly. So when working with deployments, if I want to deploy this, these are my steps in a legacy way, and these are my steps for a new deployment. And then I have another goal down here. and some steps in the legacy one and some steps in the new one. So you see there's this goal table, and it's like a task of tasks, a whole bunch of goals listed in the table and how to implement them, okay? And they've got a whole bunch of goal tables. It's a very common thing nowadays. You can see this in lots of places. And it's also another way that you might want to express this idea of workflows. Another way that you can express workflows is by doing a kind of a Visio diagram, right? Okay, so the good old-fashioned flow diagrams that plague engineering quite a lot, decision trees and stuff like that. But there's a very common problem that because you have your Visio diagrams and you fill them with text, you can have much more text than diagram, and then it's much less of a diagram, and it becomes much more cluttered. So while you are visually showing what a workflow might be like, it's not such a visual thing. It's quite difficult to decode. Or perhaps a 2D matrix, which is a bit tabular, but you can see here there's a main workflow, one set of properties, so it's like a different dimension to that workflow, and then some consequences of those properties over here. So you've got several dimensions along a main workflow. Okay, see that? Now, where we're getting to is getting more and more away from text and into something a bit more graphical, a bit more visual. And when you talk about visual process diagrams, things start to get very interesting. So here's an example of a workflow diagram. Okay, it has a bunch of steps, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, and what they've got is a whole bunch of text around it, which I'll show you in a minute, but they are demonstrating with icons the steps that you need to go through. Now, in order to do this in a diagram, what did they do? Well, let's take a look. So let's hop over to this page over here for a second, and you see how this is a diagram, okay? But as I roll my cursor over each one of these, it has a slightly different tooltip. Now, it doesn't really matter what the tooltip contains, and I don't really want to go into what this content actually means. It doesn't matter. The way that they did it was that they had to create a diagram, okay, in whatever tool they were using, if it was PowerPoint or some other format that they were using, save the diagram, create hotspots in that diagram, add links to each of those hotspots, and of course some alternate text, as you can see, that come up in the tooltips, and then publish that diagram here. And then, of course, if I click on one of these and I go to number 1 in there, then you can see that there's another diagram here. And what did they do? They took the same diagram, and now with the same hotspots and the same tooltips, but they've grayed out the ones that you haven't yet done. So it's really clear which step you're on in this 4-step process. And this is a nice visual way to show you where you are in your meta task. So we've now dipped into one of the trees. We're in there in all the details inside the weeds. We're going through all of our little steps. But let's not forget that this is step 1 of a much bigger task, and it's called connect. And I can also scroll down to the bottom here. One of the things that you'll see is what to do next. So as soon as you've done that, it points you to the next one. You see that? Or you could go back to the diagram and click that one. And when you click the next one, then of course you'll find that we're now in step 2. And you can see that they've created another separate graphic. They've manually grayed out the one before and the ones after so that you can see. And they've created all of these diagrams manually. They've grayed them all out manually. Each one has these hotspots that have been created in a tool, in a simple web editing tool, but nonetheless, and they add these hotspots manually each time. So they've had to create 4 diagrams for each of the step and 1 overall. So that's 5 diagrams. They've manually created them, graying out different ones, different bits of each diagram, adding the hotspots to all of them. Now, just imagine for a second, so let's go back here. So this is this diagram here, these process diagrams. And of course, that's great. Okay, it's more visual, it stands out. It's much more clearly apparent that you are in the middle of a much bigger task, which is really good, okay? But of course, just think for a second what that might be like to change one of these, right? Perhaps it's not install anymore, perhaps it's, you know, check prerequisites or something, I don't know. So you would have to go into each of these raw diagrams, you'd have to change the text, perhaps change the icon as well, into all of the 4, each one which has been grayed out as well, perhaps change the hotspot using your hotspot editor and so on. So it's a huge effort to change a step or to add different highlights or to add a new step, for example. And of course, different versions have different things highlighted on here, okay? And of course, your next step. So all of these things have to be manually tied in. So these guys have done a really great job at displaying these workflows. They've got a nice visual way of presenting them all, but they've gone to great lengths to create it. And woe betide, woe betide the moment that they have to change this. And now it's 6 steps or 7 steps. And of course, perhaps some of these have sub-steps associated with them. So how are we going to arrange this? And there's no real standardization. You have to go to your branding team to make sure that everything looks right for your site. It's not a short process. It's not a simple process. And the maintenance can be very, very difficult. So the story so far is that we've got these workflows. There are maps of tasks or meta tasks. They are sometimes reflected in your table of contents. Sometimes you hop around your table of contents, okay? So you need to create tasks of tasks and you need to create those steps. But of course, they're not visual at all. They're hard to follow and easily get lost in the fray. They don't really stand out at all. They're just another topic, just another set of steps. And of course, once you go into one of those topics, how are you going to find your way back to the big workflow? It's a real problem, okay? So you're in your big topic, which is a set of steps, just like we were before. If I go to one of these over here, like this one, okay? So I'm in here, and then I follow a link. When I follow that link, how do I remember where I was? And I have to then, you know, so I'm in the weeds of this, the target of this topic. I'm going to do whatever I'm doing there. How do I remember then that I was at step 2 and now I need to start on step 3? And in fact, finishing all of this, that's nothing. You're only on step 2. You've got all of these babies to finish, right? So it's actually quite a complicated thing, and there are many bits and pieces that you have to hold together. And these are everywhere. Everywhere you have to have these, okay? So some people do goal tables, some people do flow diagrams, but then you've got a lot of text clutter. And sometimes you have these process diagrams, just like we were looking at now. They're much more visual, much clearer, but there's a lot of maintenance in graying all of those things out and adding hotspots and so on. So it's a real challenge. Okay. So the first thing that we notice is that workflows, even though people don't really think about them very much, they're in content everywhere. They're in training content, they're in support content, they're in product documentation. It is one of those hidden things that just plague the product content industry. Anybody who has complicated tasks, they need to somehow grapple with this question. And how do they do that? So if I'm going to summarize, I'm going to say that workflows are this map of tasks, but typically it's a very manual process and it's really high maintenance. Okay? Basically a real pain. Now, what's really important to understand with all of these workflows is that we're looking at the same content, but dancing a different dance through that content each time. Okay, lighting a path, like I said before, through that forest. So if you have the same content, the same pool of content, it's a bit like my music library, okay? And then I've got different playlists for different situations, depending on my goal. I have a playlist for the gym, and I have a playlist for, you know, a Sunday afternoon, or I have a playlist for a rainy day, or whatever it is. So in exactly the same way, these workflows, they draw on the same pool of content that you have in your library, but just different playlists. And the reason that you might have different goals is usually because you have different personas. And each persona may be treading a slightly different path through the same content. Okay? So when I'm looking at my table of contents and I'm looking at goal 1, or perhaps goal 2, through the same content, what becomes really clear is that you can actually look at this like layers that sit on top of your table of contents. So if you have some content and it's a static set of content, you can imagine different playlists or different personas with their goals dancing a different dance as they try to work their way through this content. And that's exactly the way that we see it today. Modern portals have to be able to cope with this kind of situation. And of course, you don't want to just have simple playlists or simple workflows. Sometimes a workflow takes you across a product or across a publication. So one of the classic workflows that I'll always remember, because it was so new at the time, of course now we all take it for granted, was when Steve Jobs was on stage in in one of his keynote speeches, and he was introducing the iPhone. And it was, you know, ages ago, of course. We all take it for granted now, but he gave this product demonstration that was just striking. Everybody was going nuts in the audience. What was he doing? He was saying, okay, so here we have these maps, and here we have the contacts, and here we have a telephone, and look what I can do. So I can go onto my maps, and he goes into maps, and he types coffee, and it shows up all of the different coffee shops in the area near the conference center. And he clicks on one of them, he taps on one of them on his phone. Nobody had seen anything like this before. He taps on the phone, he taps one of the coffees, and then right there in the map, there was a dial button. And so he pushes dial and it switches over to a different product, right? Same workflow. So he starts in maps, then he moves over to the phone application, switches over to the phone application automatically. And then there on speaker was this poor innocent soul from Starbucks, and on speaker in front of all of these people and around the world, and he says, and like 350 coffees, please, to go, you know, and everybody's cracking up laughing, and it was, you know, an excellent product demonstration. but it was also a great demonstration of a workflow that takes you through a whole bunch of products, a whole bunch of features. So we're used to thinking of writing content for different products. But sometimes you can have workflows that traverse multiple products. It's the most obvious thing. And it's not just with iPhones, it's everywhere. So if you guys are writing content, whether it's training content or support content or product documentation, doesn't really matter. There are lots of situations where people need to get something done. They don't care that you started in one product and ended in another. They have a goal. That goal must be documented in some kind of workflow. Has to be, right? Because otherwise they'd never figure it out. You know, you're starting in Word and ending in Excel, or you're starting in Maps and ending in the phone. It doesn't really matter, right? So every one of these workflows, it has an aim, it has a goal, a clearly defined goal. And in order to get to that goal, you have to pass through all of these different products, right? But from a user point of view, they don't care. They just want to be able to go through from one thing to another. And if they disappear down the weeds of one thing of how to do something, they always want to know where they are in the grander scheme of things. That really, even though they've figured out where coffee is, they haven't finished yet, because we've got a much bigger goal, which is to order 350 takeaways, right? So you always need to be reminded of the bigger picture wherever you are. Okay? And this curiously looks like a journey. You're heading towards a destination. You're going from a source to a destination. You're stopping at all these stops along the way. That's exactly what it looks like. Okay? So it can be cross-product and cross-publication. And so if we were to think for a second what workflows should be represented as, I would say that the first thing that they need to be is visual. Okay, it has to be graphical. Most people, they see an image, they look at what they are supposed to do, and it really stands out from the rest of the text. There are some textual people for whom the text stands out more than the graphics, and the graphics are just noise. But most people, when they see a colorful image, the eye draws to that color. It's just one of those things that we're programmed to do. So having visual workflows, it's really powerful. I would venture to add that they should be dynamically generated. That if I'm going to arrange my workflow, and I understand that in order to get 350 coffees, I start in the maps, okay, and I do this first, and then I do that, and then I do this, and then I move on here, and then I move on there. I've got all of these steps in my mind, and I want to be able to arrange this thing. Wouldn't it be great if I could just tell a system, this is the way I want to arrange something, and to have the system dynamically generate it, automatically generate it. And it should automatically add those hotspots. Thank you very much. Instead of me having to go through all of these manual things, and then to go through and hive off each one of those entries, and then manually point to the right place so that I know where I'm going, just like I showed you before. That's something that I think should be automatic. I should definitely be able to track my place in the workflow. Okay, so some workflows, for example, setting up complicated servers on the back end of some SaaS product, for example. Well, those can spread for days and days in some cases. First, you need to assemble the equipment to make sure that you've got all of that sorted out, and then you start by setting up the operating system, and then your containers, whatever else you've got going on in there. So these things can take a long time in some cases, and you'll need to be able to remember where you are. First of all, just in case somebody else needs to take over. But also, more importantly, when I'm in the middle of one step inside one of these bits of workflows, I need to remember where I am in the bigger scheme of things as well. I need to be able to be aware that my workflows, I'm only a quarter of the way through, so I can go back and report my progress. Okay? Those workflows should easily stretch across products, across publications, so a single workflow which is visual and dynamically generated, well, I should be able to quite easily bring in different publications or different products if needed. It's just one of those things that workflows must handle. And of course, updating those workflows it shouldn't be a headache. Now, if they're dynamically generated, it should be easily maintained. And if those hotspots are automatic, then if one of those tasks needs to change, the hotspot will change with it. And then if that workflow changes, I can track my place in the workflow and still know where I am and where I need to be. That seems fair, although it is a tall order, but that seems quite fair to me. So with that list of how workflows ought to look, this is one example of how a workflow could be. Okay. Now, initially, we were going to have this presentation with the person who built this workflow, but she hopped to another company in the meantime. So I'm very happy to present that to you. She was super excited about this. And this is what they built. This is the workflow. And it looks a bit like a train journey map. Okay, now it needn't look exactly like this. It can look according to your branding. And it's dynamically generated. So the same thing that I'm seeing here can also be dynamically generated or visually represented as tiles as well. How cool is that? Or I can move back to the workflow and see the same thing. And of course, it tracks that I've done this one, and I've done this one, and this is where I am at the moment. And each one of these is a whole bunch of steps. Now, this is really important because what we want is we want it to visually stand out. We want those automatic hotspots. We want dynamically generated, and we want to track the place in the workflow and allow any topic in the whole library of your documentation library to join this workflow. So here, when I click on one of these, it's an automatic hotspot, and I can go in and read that topic. Now, when I go in and I take a look at a topic, it's just a regular topic, right? But what's really incredible is that instead of having the table of contents here, I have a nice visual view of the workflow. This is exactly where I was, right? I can see the goal at the bottom of the workflow, see? I can see where I am in the workflow, and the whole time that I'm reading through this topic, or perhaps looking at other stuff as I go down this topic. Okay, so now I'm on details, and then I go to the menu path, and so on. So I'm going through all of these things, but I'm always aware that I am part of a much bigger workflow. See that? I can visit other parts of the workflow, read that topic. And these guides can be in completely different, each one can be in a completely different publication. Now, if I do want to figure out where I am in my publication, because I actually want to look at not just this topic in the workflow, but also to look at where I am in the publication, I can also move over to the table of contents. Then I can see where I am in the table of contents. I'm actually on this little guy here at the moment. That's where I am. And I can switch back to the workflow at any time. and then go back to the map. And then I can either mark a step as done, or if I've been a little bit premature, I can mark it as undone, and then my "You are here" icon moves back. See that? And this is really powerful. I'd like to show one other demonstration of a dynamic workflow. And this is another client that implemented workflows in a very cool way. Remember, we were talking about the different personas having different workflows? So these guys have different personas, and I can move into one of these personas, understand a little bit about who this person is and what their focus is. And then when I need to, I can hop into a workflow that is especially built for this persona. Each one is a link to a page. Those pages can come from completely different guides. And then I can go back and look at another page, see? And these are workflows that will be different for each type of persona. So I think this is super cool because people grapple with this all the time. So let's look at how we started this show. We started by talking about what is a workflow. It's a map of tasks. It's often used in onboarding, in getting started, training manuals, and so on. And it helps you make sense of the content and lights a path through the forest, right? Making it clear where you need to go in this thick forest of content so that you can get to your goal. The easiest way to do this is by having a hierarchy using your table of contents. But very often, your workflow doesn't conform to that so easily. You need to hop around your table of contents. So sometimes people create tasks of tasks, as steps with links, that kind of thing, or perhaps goal tables, as we saw before, where you have different personas with different goals, just like we saw now. But all of those things are very textual, right? And it's very hard to have things stand out in that way, right? So then we're talking about workflow diagrams. We start to get more visual. There are diagrams which can be Visio diagrams, for example, but you've got to beware of text clutter. There are process diagrams where you create those diagrams one by one, each one manually graying out the things that you have already done or not yet done, putting in your next steps in each and every place and pulling all of those threads together to make it happen. And those are beautiful, no doubt. They're carefully branded with your marketing team, perhaps, but it's very high maintenance. And of course, these are everywhere, time and a lot of effort. They plague documentation. So it's like the silent beast that kind of roams the corridors and terrorizes people, because how are you going to manage this? Everybody does it a different way, and there's no real standard on how to present workflows in content. So we think that visual workflows are really the way forward. They stand out very clearly and obviously. They're almost instantly recognizable when you look at them because they're visual and because they're laid out in such an easy way. They can be dynamically generated, have automatic links to the right places, And then, of course, you need to be able to track your place in the workflow when you're looking at the workflow as a whole, or when you're in the weeds and you're in the middle of one of those steps. You need to know where you are in the bigger picture. You need to be able to look up and see where you are in the bigger scheme of things. And then, of course, you need to remember that workflows often, not always, but often stretch across a product suite. Very often companies have lots of products because they don't just want to offer products, they want to offer a solution. And solution thinking is all about trying to take the bigger view and trying to see how these different tasks can be knitted together to create a bigger tapestry, to create much more than just a task. You create a much bigger picture. And that bigger picture can help inform people to order 350 takeaway coffees, for example. And of course, they need to be easy to maintain and easy to update. So creating one of these workflows should be very simple. You should be able to pull in content, nest content, be able to point to certain tasks, and for the title of those tasks to come through and shine through very quickly and very easily. That should all be done automatically. Okay. So that's my take on visual workflows. Thank you very much. So I'm going to stop sharing now.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us. I'm back on camera now, so if you'll share your camera, Lawrence, we can both be on here together and chat a bit. I'm trying to navigate here unsuccessfully in the slide deck carousel here to take some questions from the audience. I'm going to show us both on the screen here for just a second, but just to let the audience members know, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so by using the Ask a Question tab located below your webinar viewing panel. That'll help you submit a question to us. We've got a couple for you today, so let's start with those. I'm going to switch this back to video for a second. So thank you for your presentation. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time, and I appreciate how diligent you were about explaining them. What makes, one of the questions we had was, what makes these dynamic?
What makes them dynamic is that they are generated on the fly. So you don't set these in stone by creating static graphics that can't be moved without going in and editing those graphics and planting those graphics artificially into the topic and then artificially threading in the next step and so on. All you need to do, all you should need to do really, is just set up your steps and your sub-steps and sub-sub-steps, each one pointing to a different link.
Yeah.
And then the whole thing should just come up all by itself.
I don't understand what the whole thing is. It's very ambiguous. What is actually interpreting these cues? Is it Zoomin Software that's doing that and then making a dynamic image, or is there some other tool involved that needs to be connected to Zoomin in order to display those workflows the way that you showed them?
Right. So in the case that you've got a portal with Zoomin, then we do that automatically. It's just a simple configuration file where you nest those files, you nest those tasks together one after the other. Really, really simple. And then the Zoomin engine can automatically, dynamically create these either tiles or dynamic workflows. You can have them switch between the two, as I showed, very easily.
And so we're still getting some confusion about this. So
okay.
What is the tool that you're using to create the workflow is what one of our viewers wants to know.
Right. So as part of the documentation portal, its engine, okay, the engine has to have search capabilities. It has to have display capabilities. It has to have tiling capabilities for navigation. So as part of those tiling capabilities, you can use that same engine for creating navigation tiles and those hierarchical navigation tiles, but just display them as workflows if you want. It should be a simple switch that you switch on and off, but it's that same engine for navigating a site, which you would normally do traditionally with tiles,
Yeah.
you can also do using workflows. That's how you can generate them dynamically.
Okay, great. I think the confusion lies in the fact that many of our users are using a combination of tools, and often most of the markup is done in the authoring phase, and then other tools into
Right.
those commands and do
Ex-
what
right.
is needed.
Right. And that's
To make it work, go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead. No, I was just going to say that if you have just one authoring tool, that might work.
Right.
But when you have teams with multiple authoring tools, like some people might be working in Ditta, and some people might be working, some teams might be working in Paligo or in Flare or in Authorit or Swagger, Markdown. And very often you have these companies where these teams must work together, publish to the same place, although they have different tools because they have different needs.
Yeah.
And then you want to try to create a workflow that crosses all of those domains. And the only thing they have in common is their destination, which is where you publish them.
Sure, sure.
And that's what Zoomin does.
To make the workflow maps work, what is happening behind the scenes? Is there a tagging infrastructure? Someone wants to know.
So that's cool. Okay, so you can theoretically put together something with tags if you want. The problem with doing it with tags is that if I'm going to collect, for example, all of the topics that are getting started topics for APIs, for example, it's going to be hard to order those just with tags, right? And sometimes a workflow, very often a workflow has a very specific order. You go here first, and then you go there, and then you make the phone call to Starbucks, right? You don't do, you can't just pick each one at any time. So if you did it using tags, you wouldn't be able to determine the order. So it really has to be very deliberate. And you have to say, okay, first this, then this, then this. It just should be easy. That's the whole point.
Sure. Well, okay. Speaking of easy, someone admitted that they were a little confused about this. How much easier is it than creating a super task or multiple super tasks for individual goals with nested navigation that shows you where you are in the flow?
Well, I think it's much easier because if you have to, well, first of all, if you're going to just create a task, you can do that. It's quite easy, but it won't stand out. It won't stand out at all. It's just going to be another topic.
Yeah.
And when you have that topic and you've followed a link across to some other place, and now you're in the weeds of that task, how are you going to remember where you were in the bigger picture of things? There's no real map to guide you that you're actually only on step 2 of 7 big long steps, and you have to go back to the next one. So doing it traditionally, it can be quite easy to author it, I suppose, but the user experience really sucks. In other words, you really want to try to have that visual element and try to remember where you are in that whole process. And that kind of thing needs to be focused much more on the user experience rather than on the authoring experience.
Right. And one of our viewers pointed that out. I was getting a tweet from somebody who said, this sounds a lot like the customer journey, although it also sounds like we're forcing people to go down a process we want them to go down instead of the process they wish they could go down. So I think learn lessons from doing this, right? Like so here's a question for you that comes out of my mind based on that comment. Since we could tell where people are in the journey, we could see that they've completed, for example, step 1 and step 2. Can we automatically then say, if they leave, that we remember where they are and we tell them again? And can we trigger that to trigger another task? Oh, you've completed task 1 and 2. Don't forget you have 3, 4, and 5 to come up with, so that we're kind of identifying maybe places in the customer journey where people fall off, right? Because later we may say, wow, every time people get to step 3, we have 40% of the people don't go on to step 4. Why is that? And maybe this is our forensic detective skills coming into play here.
Sure, exactly. So analytics, one of the things, oh, that's such a cool idea. So one of the things that analytics could easily do is track people's progress. So the system is already tracking the progress. The question is, can we collate all of that information together? And just like you said, everybody goes dark after step 3. That's not a good thing, right? And we want to be able to track that and then trace that back to perhaps where people are going dark and saying, okay, this is really something we've got to fix, and then fix it. So that's really an excellent example of the power of analytics doing something insightful. I really like it. I'm going to pass that on. I think that's a really cool idea, actually.
Really good. Thank you to Bettina was her name who submitted that. Another viewer said, Google is now extracting video content at a micro level. At our company, they're actually extracting step-by-step procedures, and then displaying them, allowing users to click right to a specific portion of a video, the part that answers the question that they're asking, not make me watch the whole video to get to it. And I know this is kind of the same thing we're after here. Do you think we could combine those two together and have the step-by-step workflow with the step-by-step video snippets that would go along with it, so that people could decide, yes, I need to go to the next step, but I don't want to read about it this time, I want to watch it.
Right. So this is cool. This is very cool. This is a really emerging sector in product content, which is videos. Now, lots of people think, I hate reading, I just want videos, especially people whose native language may not be the language in which it's written, or and it's just much easier for people to understand the talking head and so on. They like that very, very much. It's an emerging market, of course. Speech to text, like Siri and Alexa and all of those others. Just have to be careful that nothing starts up when I say that. But
too, I turned them off, luckily.
But then when that happens, then people then you can start to auto transcribe all of these videos, go through it, and there's a lot of that out there today, where you can have content that is auto-transcribed, and then it can be mined, it can be searched, people can find it, and then they can jump to that particular part of the video to be able to carry on.
Which might be a kind of a best practice that we're going to have to develop, which is when we go to make videos, although you can certainly make an overview video that doesn't contain all the little steps, people still need the steps, and Google's going to look for them in the video. So if they are there, they can extract them, and make their psychic power, looking at your script, they can pull out just the pieces that a user needs, which means that they may never actually land on our portal.
So this is the thing. So when you're focused on user experience, you're not so much focused on whose portal they're in. You just want people to get the answer that they need. This is their product. This is, they've purchased your product. They need an answer. Now, hopefully they won't go to your competitor's site. So you want to try to get people to read your content. That's always useful. When you have a product, you want to make sure that people come to your site. It's very helpful. So the question is, how can we get all of the content here, make it as rich in SEO as possible, have people come to the place, and then be able to use that as part of their workflow and understand where they are in it all the time.
Agreed. We have lots of questions that people could definitely ask on this topic. So I think we should mature this idea and come back and view what they're doing a little bit later. Maybe we could find Sarah's replacement at your client company and see how they mature the solution, because I think there's a ton of interesting and useful things in here. In fact, I'll invite you back again to talk about this in the future, because there were also questions about how localizing this content and also kind of making derivatives of it, which I think it brings us down a different path, but very interesting nonetheless. So thank you very much, Lawrence, for being our guest today. Thank you very much for having me. Very nice to be here. Thank you. Welcome. And thank you to Zoomin Software, who is the sponsor of today's show. So we're going to say goodbye to Lawrence. You can definitely check him out and learn a little bit more about Zoomin Software. They've got a great Twitter account, which I also encourage you to follow at Zoomin Software. Today's show is brought to you by Zoomin Software. For those of you who missed my earlier announcement, Zoomin transforms technical product content into dynamic and intuitive customer experiences. just so people can find the answers they need to use your product or service to the fullest without any frustration. Zoomin's got a cloud-based solution that allows you to streamline content operations and gain powerful analytics so that you can refine your content strategy, learn from user behavior, and improve customer service over time. To learn more about how Zoomin can help you improve customer experience with your content and your technical documentation, point your web browser over to zoominsoftware.com and you can learn a little bit more there and even request a demonstration, and I encourage you to do so. Also, in the attachments and links section of today's webinar viewing panel, you can download some content provided by Zoomin and link over to their various social media platforms to keep up with what they're doing at the company. Our next show, let's see, December the 10th, that's tomorrow. I'll be talking with Paul Wlodarczyk of Products about connecting salespeople to customers with technology and content. Patrick Bozek and I host a weekly, bi-weekly show called Coffee and Content, where we interview content professionals. This will be a very interesting topic on digital selling. We'll also have Kit Brown Hoekstra joining us for a traditional webinar on December the 16th, where she's going to share 3 practical metrics and how to use them to help you measure the value of your localization content. Then that show is brought to you by Precision Content. And at the end of the 2020 season, we wrap up with my friend and some professional enterprise content strategy leader, Anna Schlegel, who works for NetApp. We'll be interviewing her on Coffee and Content about how she's leading content strategy across the entire enterprise. And there's a big company at NetApp, and she's got lots of interesting suggestions to help you figure out how you might do the same thing. And in the new year, we're going to bring our Content Advantage program, which Megan Gilhooly from Zoomin Software and I co-host. And the very first guest will be Mark Hellinger, who's going to be speaking to us about how to automate the creation of video documentation, especially for software companies. You're not going to want to miss that show. My name is Scott Abel, the Content Wrangler. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to give us a 1 through 5-star rating on the way out the door using the Rate This tab. Let Lawrence know what you thought about the quality of the information he provided. 5 stars is a high rating, and there's a little field to allow you to share your comments with him as well. I know he'd appreciate it. Don't forget to check out the attachments section on your way out, download some content. You've been watching How to Drive Onboarding and Training Success with Dynamic Workflows featuring Lawrence Orin of Zoomin Software on the Content Wrangler Network on Bright Talk. Thanks for joining us. Be safe, be well, keep doing great work. We'll see you at another webinar again soon. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.